Welcome back to the channel. If you want to show your support, please subscribe and leave a comment or a thumbs up. It really helps out with getting more eyeballs and earholes on this stuff. Now, I'm beginning to think that responding to national emergencies may not be the Morrison government's strong suit. Let's take a look at the past couple of weeks to see if my suspicions are correct. We'll start by jumping back in time a few months. November 2021. The Bureau of Meteorology declare our La Nina weather event, which is predicted to last into 2022. As 2021 drew to a close, the Morrison government's Emergency Response Fund celebrated its second birthday. Rather than having been used for one of its stated purposes, the fund remained untouched, accruing hundreds of millions in interest for the government.
That this fund has been operational for nearly 2 years. It's earned the government over $700 million in interest, but as we sit here now, it hasn't spent a cent in the sense of money being provided to anyone else.
At this point, no money has flowed.
On the 23rd of February, forecasts began to look grim. By the weekend, massive amounts of Queensland and New South Wales were underwater. That's when Mr. Potato Head popped up with his GoFundMe page. It didn't go over very well and just serves to highlight the massive amount of cash the government has been sitting on for years. The PM couldn't see a problem with it.
I commend Peter for what he's doing. I don't understand the criticism of it, frankly. I really don't.
But maybe he thought outsourcing the emergency response to the community was just the way to go. As time went on, it got to the point where you wondered if the federal government was going to respond at all. Then the PM caught COVID and he released his proof of life video.
First of all, can I just thank everybody for their very kind wishes after I confirmed last night that I tested positive for COVID, and also for your kind words in relation to Jen and the girls.
Now at this point, one of two things needs to be true. Either one, the Prime Minister is too sick to continue working and performing his duties, in which case the Deputy Prime Minister should be stepping up. Or two, the Prime Minister is well enough and can continue working from isolation. Apparently the Prime Minister didn't trust Barnaby to run the show, so he decided he'd continue working from his COVID bunker. While we continue to hear some incredible stories of Aussies doing their own search and rescue activities, we waited to get any real response from the government. It got to the point where even Koshy was starting to make sense.
Are you embarrassed that ordinary Australians are having to do so much work in this? Ordinary Australians are having to get themselves to remote areas in their dinghies, wading through floodwaters to help people, to take them food and to make sure they're all right.
No, Koshy, that's the Australian spirit.
No.
I'm just not going to cop criticism of the ADF.
No one was actually criticising the ADF on the ground. They were in fact criticising Mr. Potato Head.
Who do they report to? Who's coordinating all of this? Is there one single person?
Well, there is one single person, and
Oof, this is really hard to watch.
there is. It's quite. If you've got 10 minutes, I can go into the command structure of it.
Actually, I do have 10 minutes, but it's not going to take 10 minutes for you to explain to me that this guy reports to you.
But they've got
just need one
a major
person.
general who's running the operation.
Yeah, who does he
They've got a major
report to
general
up
who's
there?
running the operation. Well, he reports ultimately to the Chief of the Defence Force.
Who ultimately reports to Mr. Potato Head.
And again, I'm just not going to cop criticism of these guys and girls who do an amazing job.
Yeah, not criticising the people on the ground.
Definitely need to reiterate, we're not
Criticising the
criticising the
people on the
ADF
ground.
on the ground.
No, it's
Nobody is.
Skip ahead a few more days and the PM emerges from his COVID bunker. You know, just like one of those characters from The Croods.
I like the movie.
Thanks, PM.
I announced my intention to recommend to the Governor-General a national emergency declaration covering the severe weather and flooding events across both New South Wales and Queensland.
Now, this is all good, but why did you have to wait over a week to do this?
And that declaration requires me to consult both with the New South Wales Premier and the Queensland Premier. I've spoken to the New South Wales Premier today. The way this occurs is they both write to me requesting that be put in place, and I've had a positive discussion with the New South Wales Premier today. I'm meeting with the Queensland Premier tomorrow when I'm in Brisbane, and all of that being in train, I intend to meet with the Governor-General on Friday in Canberra to be able to complete those formalities.
Is it not a flawed plan that the premiers have to write to you in writing to be able to get this to declared a disaster? Everyone could see last week that it was going to be a disaster here.
Well, that's the requirement of legislation.
Is it though? Now, I'm not a lawyer, but the way I read this, the Prime Minister doesn't need to wait for the states to write to him. The scale of this disaster was fairly obvious to the world at least a week before this announcement. So why did he wait until the first day he was allowed out of his COVID cave to make it? He was working, right? I'll be honest, I've racked my brain, and the only reason I can think of for the delay is so that he could make the announcement in front of the cameras. This was a photo op.
You stay classy.
Australia is becoming a harder country to live in because of these natural disasters. Commonwealth Government does not run the 000 service. So, hang on, I haven't finished. Obviously, climate change is having an impact here in Australia, as it is in every country around the world. I'll tell you what's not going to fix climate change. What's not going to fix it is just doing something in Australia. You know, you can get a warm, fuzzy feeling here in Australia, and I think it's great that we've reduced emissions by 20%, and I think it's great we've got a commitment to get to net zero by 2050.
The fact is, the Prime Minister didn't need to wait for anyone to make the national emergency declaration. But when he was criticised for the delay, Morrison went back to what he does best.
The Labor Party, Labor government.
The Labor Party,
The Labor Party, Labor, the Labor Party,
Labor.
Blaming the states.
The flood mitigation works in Australia are primarily a state responsibility. The primary responsibility for these issues rests with the Queensland Government. I mean, all through the pandemic, I was reminded every single day by premiers and by the media about what the responsibilities of state governments had and the restrictions they could put in place and how they could tell people to live their lives, and they were their responsibilities.
This is federal funding that could have been made available.
Federal funding was allocated across a large number of projects here in Queensland and other states and territories. It wasn't an unlimited fund, and priorities were set and decisions were made. But when it comes to particularly urban water management and things of that nature, these are responsibilities of local authorities and the state government. So I think the question I could equally put to you, why haven't they funded them? Why do state governments constantly come to the federal government to pay for things that are responsibilities of state government? We have the strongest economy in the advanced world. We have had higher jobs growth and higher economic growth than any of the G7 countries over the last 2 years. We've got one of the highest rates of vaccination anywhere in the world, and we've got one of the lowest death rates from COVID in the country, in the world. So I would say that that's a trifecta of achievement for all governments across this country. And so while some may want to focus on the odd disagreements, the actual results, as they say, if you look at the scoreboard says we've saved 40,000 lives together. The scoreboard says that we've got 250,000 more jobs than we did before the pandemic. The scoreboard says that we have one of the highest vaccination rates. It's around 95% double dose vaccination of the population aged over 16. About what the responsibilities of state governments had and the restrictions they could put in place and how they could tell people to live their lives, and they were their responsibilities. That says that the cooperation actually does take place. Thank you very much.
When the Queensland Premier suggested the declaration was a week late,
the time for that national emergency was probably a week ago. So we've actually gone past that. The floodwaters have gone down.
Morrison attempted to shift the blame back to her. The Morrison government has a habit of deflection. Whenever they're criticised, they'll instead deflect, making it sound as though the criticism is actually of someone else.
But don't blame the ADF, okay? We won't cop that. The ADF are doing an amazing job.
It does two things. It allows the Morrison government to deflect the criticism, as well as giving them the opportunity to leap to the defence of others, standing up for others and against the bullies. Here are some recent examples. The French president accuses Morrison of lying to him.
Do you think he lied to you?
I don't think. I know.
Morrison tries to reframe it as
sledging of Australia. I'm not going to cop sledging of Australia. I'm not going to cop that on behalf of other Australians.
No, it was not sledging of Australians. It was a criticism of Scott Morrison. When Morrison was criticised for the hair-washing photo opportunity, Morrison tried to deflect that criticism, suggesting that in criticising him, people were sneering at millions of Australians. No. And when the Morrison government are criticised for their glacial response to the floods, they attempt to reframe that as a criticism of the ADF.
But don't blame the ADF, okay? We won't cop that.
I'm just not going to cop criticism of the ADF.
We won't cop that.
No. The government's response to the floods has highlighted almost all of the government's shortcomings in one consolidated package. A snail's paced response to an emergency, the deflection, the announcements, the photo ops, and the lack of genuine action, the blame shifting, the lies, it's all been on display. The other thing the events of the past few weeks can tell us is that If Morrison's going to hang on to contest the next election, he'll be trying to push the election date as far back as possible, hoping that people forget the latest fiasco. Thanks for watching.